Welcome to the Prison Pod, a podcast for all people experiencing incarceration. The mission of this podcast is to save lives, restore hope, reduce suffering, and recidivism. Many show ideas come directly from the listeners, so please write the host. Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine, 04473. Here is your host, Ms. Valerie.
Joining us today is Brian Koehn, who is the founder and CEO of Social Purpose Corrections. Brian has a background that started in the military and then on to corrections, where he's done a multitude of jobs, including being a warden and overseeing security within various prisons. Brian brings many years of experience to the work he does today, focusing on making real change within the prison culture. I'd like to welcome Brian to the Prison Pod.
Good morning, Valerie. Appreciate you being or inviting me to your podcast. I'm excited to have a conversation today.
Well, that's great. First thing I want to ask you is, what inspired you to create Social Purpose Corrections, and how is it different than just regular old corrections?
Well, I think to start off, frustration. Well, maybe it'd be helpful to kind of tell my story, give your listeners a perspective of my background and why we're here today. So, I served in the Marines, went out, was discharged and got my bachelor's, and was looking for a law enforcement job, actually. And I was in Minnesota, which was where I'm from, and there's this independent, city-owned private prison being opened in western Minnesota. I was like, corrections. Well, I've never had any ambition to work inside of a prison, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do career-wise either. And so I started off as a summer job in this city-owned economic development project, really, which is what it was. And they hired me as a first-line supervisor right off the bat because of my military experience, because it was a startup facility. And the first contract they had was with Puerto Rico. Picture this, putting Puerto Ricans in Minnesota. Turned out not to be such a great idea, but it was the start of a career. And then one of the big private prison companies bought that facility, which allowed me to get access to, instead of one prison, access to, I think it was 70 some at the time, facilities as a career. So I started off drinking the Kool-Aid of corrections that pretty much everyone in our country drinks. And that's when they put you in an academy and say, okay, this is how we do corrections, us versus them. The enemy, in essence, is the incarcerated population. This is safety and security trumps everything. Public safety first, institutional safety and security second. Starting with staff and then residents. Actually, they use the term inmates. I use the word residents. And they give you this. They fill this big cup of Kool-Aid for you and how you do corrections. You can't have a long conversation with an incarcerated person because you might be compromised. We move your post every day because we don't trust you because you might be compromised. Bad things happen inside of a prison, and then they ramp it up 2 or 3 steps because they have to prevent it from happening again. So then everyone gets punished for the actions of a few kind of concept. Well, I didn't know any better. I mean, I was being taught how to do corrections by very senior corrections professionals, and I drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, this is how we do it. If you're good at doing it the way that U.S. Corrections says you're supposed to do it, well, then you get promoted. Well, I was good at it. And I was promoted quickly. In fact, I was promoted to for one of the big private prison companies, the first head of security of the whole company. So I was over 66 prisons and jails across the United States. I was the head Kool-Aid guy. I was the one that replicated what I was taught because that's what I thought was supposed to happen. Well, then I took my first warden job of 5. And, I started to really, maybe not as much on my first warden job, but better understand the root cause of the challenges in U.S. corrections. And coming from private prisons, it's a different model because you're a corrections person, but you're also a business person because you have to make the revenue for the for-profit company. And so you look at the problem a little bit different than you would maybe a government corrections exclusive kind of person. And I think it was the second warden job that I really started to, as I was looking at root cause equals efficiencies, and efficiencies are important. I really started to pay attention to the outcomes in our country, like recidivism, like violence, like the cost. Like the correctional officer lifespan is 58 years old. So it's like 17 years less than general society. Number 1 suicide rate in any occupation in the United States, correctional officers. Number 1 divorce rate, correctional officers. Well, you're starting to get the theme here. Then looking past correctional officers, there's not a ton of research on it, but for an incarcerated person, it's like every day you serve is a day off your life. Now, I don't necessarily believe that, but point being is prisons are stressful, whether you're working there or you're incarcerated in there. And I started questioning the Kool-Aid. Why do we rotate officers all the time? Well, I know why, because we're afraid they're going to get compromised by the incarcerated population. If they get compromised, then they bring in drugs and guns and fall in love, and all those are really bad. But none of that stuff can happen. And really, what's the message we're sending to the staff? We don't trust you. That's the message we're sending to the staff. And then the side effect of that is when you have inconsistency inside of a prison, the staff don't get to know the incarcerated either. And that, of course, that's done intentionally, but the reality is that's a root cause. If I'm a correctional officer in a pod and I'm in that same pod every day, I will know the incarcerated population. I'll know the residents. I'll know if somebody's having a good day or a bad day. I'll know to call mental health right away because, holy cow, somebody is not the same. And you have to be a mental health professional to see somebody's down to get them help right away, as an example. So I really started to question the Kool-Aid of how U.S. corrections was done. And I almost to the point where I intentionally questioned everything because I started to distrust what I was taught in the first place. Now, there are things that need to happen inside of a prison, but the reality is do they have to happen this way? Does it have to be an us versus them? The enemy is not the incarcerated population. The enemy is recidivism. That's the enemy. And so if we're going to have a purpose in corrections, it should be to fight to help residents become better, get them access to programming opportunities. So that started the journey. I'll pause there because I can talk forever in case you have questions, but I can get into why social purpose corrections.
Well, I think you made an important note that it's the way things were always done. So this is the way we do it. But as you mentioned, a very serious thing is recidivism rates are not coming down. We're seeing a demand that everyone wants to build more prisons. And we're seeing people that are in prison 20, 30, 40 years where maybe something could have been done 20 years ago that they could have been released in 10. So you worked for private prisons. Can you explain a little bit about, I don't know if that's possible, the difference between a private prison and a regular government-run prison?
There's not as much difference as people think. So 8% of the beds in the United States are run by for-profit private companies. So that by far minority within the country. But it's a contract model where the government puts out an RFP or a request for proposal for a private company to manage the incarcerated population. And typically what they do is there's two models. It's called manage only or build manage. So manage only means the government owns the building and a private company runs it. And then build manage means the private company builds it and then they manage it. So they own the building and the management aspect of it. And so what happens is the government puts out this RFP says, basically, you'll do corrections our way, only you do it cheaper because their purpose for a private business is to bring efficiency into the government world, where government is not known for being efficient. And then they make money off of it. There are a couple of billion-dollar revenue companies in the private prison world. Part of the challenge is the government requires the privates to do it their way. Well, that's not innovation. They have what's called heads and beds contract model, so they're paid by the number of people incarcerated, which in my opinion is the first model. If a non-government entity is in corrections, they should be required to be outcomes-based. So when we help society, then we're rewarded versus we're paid for the numbers of people incarcerated. So private prisons are by far the minority, like I said, 8% of the beds, and that's actually, with immigration now, that's probably spiked quite a bit. With state contracts, you'll see that there's a bit of a reduction. In fact, Texas just took back 7 of their private prisons in October of last year. So that's really the difference in privates. It's all corrections. It's very similar in operational nature. It's just that the privates are supposed to bring efficiency to the table to help the government in concept.
I'm very curious, during your career, did the words compassion or empathy ever come up?
Oh, constantly. The privates aren't bad people. They're human beings managing human beings. So yeah, I worked for private prison for 28 years. I wouldn't have stayed if I thought they were unethical or immoral. So it's just a different cultural model. And I caution people not to focus in on privates. And some support them, some don't, but focus on the bigger problem. And that's how we operate. It's a culture of corrections across our country, whether it's private or government, because government controls corrections. They control privates by contract. And so, focus on the bigger picture of how do we adjust the culture and how we do corrections in the United States to change the outcomes. And really, it's all about human beings. It's about recidivism. It's about giving people a fair opportunity for a good free life upon release. In corrections, especially secure corrections, prisons, jails. That's kind of community corrections. That's their job once they get out kind of thing. Now it's overgeneralization. Obviously, there's programming that needs to happen inside. But in essence, we release people from prison without jobs and housing. Well, and sometimes without education. Education is one of the key driver on reduction of recidivism. But we also know if you don't have a job and housing when you're released, desperate people make desperate choices. Many don't have a family structure or friends to fall back on. They're just released. I know one state, many of the incarcerated are released to the city park with a tent. It's just because they have nowhere to go. And so, those are the challenges that we have to address in our country. On how do we change? And that's part of the reason why our nonprofit exists.
So can you talk a little bit about the knowledge that you gained throughout the years of your career and how you apply that now to come up with solutions to some of the problems we've been dealing with for multiple of years?
Well, I can answer that in two ways. Number one, I was known as a prison fixer. So I was, as a warden, I was transferred from place to place to fix cultures, in essence. And so, not that I had all the answers, but I was smart enough to listen to people who did the job every day to find the answers. And that's both the incarcerated inside the facilities and the staff that did the job every day. So it's not like I had all this magic, epiphany. I know how to fix all this. No, I was just smart enough to listen to people who did the job every day. And so all that experience gave me the confidence to start our nonprofit, to bring a new operational model to how we operate prisons and jails in the United States. But importantly is there's a lot of good practices in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of Department of Corrections doing some really cool things. It's just that there's not, I think, a good job about how do we scale that? How do we share that? How do we use that, within the different cultures and different systems? I mean, if you think about it, you have the 50 states Department of Corrections, and then how many jails do we have? Thousands of them. So, I mean, it's not exactly, although there are organizations that connect, which are good, but still in many ways it's a bit disconnected. But I've also been to Norway. I've studied the Scandinavian model. I've been to the UK. There are 3 other nonprofit prison companies in the world. I've toured 2 of them and talked to the CEO of the 3rd. By the way, they have a significant reduction in recidivism with their models. We can talk about that more. But yeah, what happened is throughout the years, I mean, I'm probably one of the most diverse, or definitely one of the top diverse operators in the United States, because I manage Bureau of Prisons and contracts, so incarcerated, and again, in privates, when you manage a government agency, you become part of their culture. You have to replicate their culture. So Bureau of Prisons, U.S. Marshals detention, immigration detention, multiple states, couple jails, max custody, minimum custody, pretty much the gamut. Oh, I didn't do any juvenile, and of course, privates don't ever do death row. So outside of that, I pretty much, I had 16 different jurisdictions that I managed. And those are all little different cultures. And you learn from every one of them because they got their goods and they got their not so goods. And so, learning all of that, in a life full of experience of really changing culture and fixing problems, gave me the confidence to start the U.S.'s first nonprofit outcomes-based prison organization. It's really designed to bring innovation to our government leaders to help them solve problems. So I think I answered your question.
And before I forget it, can you give us the website so people can write that down?
Well, the nonprofit's name is Social Purpose Corrections. The website is spcor.org.
Okay, great. We're going to take a quick pause here to hear from our sponsors and supporters, and we will be right back.
Attention! Corrio, a better way to connect with loved ones who are incarcerated. Without Corrio, family and friends wait for a call and hope they can answer. With Corrio, inmates can call or message at any time. When your inmate calls their Corrio number, they will hear your voice and text messages. Inmates receive and leave messages at any time using standard prison phones, making connection easy and predictable. For information about Corrio, visit Corrio.org. Stay connected.
Music by Stir Crazy Music. www.stircrazymusic.com.
Welcome back to the Prison Pod. I want to remind you that we're talking with Brian Koehn, and I hope I'm saying your name right.
You are. I'm impressed.
Okay. And we're talking about social purpose corrections and how we can do things a little bit differently to reduce our recidivism rates and our cost of corrections. So, Brian, was there something when you was doing your work that you saw was outstanding in corrections?
Wow. There's not a lot of outstanding. There's a lot of good. This is after I founded SPC, but I had an opportunity to tour the Maine state prison, and really didn't understand what Maine was doing, but I heard they were doing some pretty cool stuff. And understand when I tour a prison, my lens is different. It's very operational. I was the head security person, so I was the head of all tactical teams. I solved riots and hostages as a leader. I managed very difficult facilities, and so my lens is different than 99.9% of the people who walk inside of a facility. And manipulate me, maybe that's the right word for it, but to show only the good parts of a prison, with the assumption that the whole place runs well. And I was really impressed by the Maine State Prison, some of the stuff they're doing. They were allowed incarcerated to do businesses. These are good behavior folks, and you had to earn it, but they actually had internet out of their cell. Wow. Never seen that before. And they don't have any problems with it. And they have a very Scandinavian approach. Ryan Thornell and the director, I think, did an excellent job while they were there, kind of changing that culture. And this was their max custody facility. Sex offenders lived in population. That just doesn't happen very often. Because typically sex offenders, when they walk into the pods, the races will make them show them papers. If they're a sex offender, they're told to leave or they're going to be hurt. And then they get put in either restrictive housing or a segregated unit, and they didn't have that there. There wasn't tension walking the pods. The restrictive housing unit only had 2 people in it. This is a max custody prison. I've seen them with hundreds of people in it before. And they had 2, and they were on their way out, so that's clearly a reflection of a different culture. Maine is smaller. It's less violent. It's less gang problems. I mean, there's always apples and oranges here. So just to be straight with that, but they were doing some really cool stuff, and so, Norway, the Scandinavian model, I've toured that, very impressive. I caution people that think, we need to bring Norway to the United States where we are mass incarceration. They are not. Their social systems are way different than ours. Their budgets are different than ours. But the principle of dynamic security and to educate, there's basically, I'm overgeneralizing here, but there's 2 types of security. You have static security, which we use in the U.S., and you have dynamic security, which is more Scandinavian, German, European-ish model. Static security is very us versus them. Dynamic security, the officers are encouraged to have a professional, and I'll use the word relationship, that's a trigger word for many in corrections, but a professional engagement with the incarcerated folks. In order to, better have the culture and environment that's open to change and reform versus the races against each other or the gangs against each other or the staff against the incarcerated or all the things that happen in the United States. So yeah, I mean, there's a nonprofit in Belize, the only prison in Belize. And when the government ran it, they had 70% recidivism rate. When the nonprofit ran it, they're claiming 17% recidivism rate. There's some changes there. They're a faith-based prison. Faith isn't a program in their facility. It's core to their culture. Now, it's not just one faith, it's all faiths. But the point being is they're very faith supportive. I was in South Korea last year. They have a nonprofit prison there that's significantly lower recidivism. And, and a lot of it has to do with the way that the staff and incarcerated interact. So it's the best practices out there. I'm just scratching the surface. A lot of good things happening in the U.S. Specifically. Some of the stuff that happens overseas is good, but you got to filter it for us. I mean, in Norway, their largest prisons, like 270 incarcerated people. My last prison as warden was 5,000, more in one place than their whole country has by a long shot. I mean, so there are differences, but you still got to filter that stuff and take the good that we can use within our systems in order to change culture.
I think we have to look at, when I was first going into the prisons, when I first started going to the Supermax was in 2003. It was a brand new prison. And so everything had to be worked out, and it was quite different than it is today. And I'm talking here in Maine, because that's where I am. So it's and it is amazing that the work that they were doing, I was actually involved with the Awakening Exchange, which was a group that was being run out of the state prison. And it was remarkable because they were allowed to connect with people across the world. It wasn't just within our state. And we really had some great conversations. And I think a lot of people had their eyes open to the idea that there are people in prisons. They're not just inmates. They're not people we want to lock away forever and a day. They have purpose. And even people doing a life sentence can have a purpose from behind bars. So, that's where I see a need for things like allowing people to write books, to be on podcasts, of course, there has to be restrictions, but those who have proven themselves to have been through their programming and doing what they're supposed to be doing, a lot of them are better educated than some people out here in the world on how to make those changes and differences. I have a total different question to ask you, and you may not even remember him. But a few years back, you did a podcast with Philip A. Jones, who is an incarcerated
Hmm.
person.
Yeah, that
Do
was
you remember
interesting.
that?
Yeah, that was pretty cool. Yeah, on the
I'm
phone inside the
curious how
prison. Yeah,
you I'm curious how you guys met.
and networking is everything. And social media, it's we're getting more well known now. As a bit of a disruptor in the space. Um, and so yeah, no, I was, if I recall, I can't remember if somebody referred us or if it was a social media reach out. Through his wife or his partner at the time. Yeah, it was interesting because it was hard to hear him, and then the phone timed out, and then we had to recall, and then it was just like, this is kind of cool. Doing a podcast with somebody while they're incarcerated. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do remember that.
I'm really hoping that they're going to start allowing more of that. I was granted permission to do an audio call interview to California just recently. And I love the idea that people inside are getting their voices outside to change the stigma. That the idea that there are a lot of people that are in prison who are working very hard every single day to make change and improve not just their own lives, but the other people that are living with them. And I'd like us to start highlighting a little bit more than that, than the gang activity and the fights and all the negative that we see on our crime shows, because I think if the focus was changed a little bit, we'd see more people supporting those types of programs.
Agree. I mean, we're doing a lot of op-eds now for like The Hill. We just had one, Adam Clauston and I. Adam was our first hire in SPC. He did 20 years of a 213-year sentence in the feds. And how do we educate the general public to, Marine term, combat, the narrative that's being put out there right now, and it's, a high profile case happens and it hits the emotional chord of everybody in the country when something really awful happens, somebody is shot or raped or, high profile stuff. Well, then everyone sees that incident and makes a judgment of everybody who's inside the system. Well, that's not even close to being the case. I've talked to thousands and thousands of incarcerated people as a warden and coming up through the ranks, and many of them are good people that really made a bad choice. Most of them when they were younger too. When you get late 30s, early 40s, I can't count the number of times I walked away from conversations thinking, man, they don't need to be in here. But corrections doesn't have that choice. It's not us who decides how long they're there. It's the courts, and so, how can you use that experience in order to educate people? And our nonprofit, I'd love to get funding to do a national education campaign on corrections to combat some of especially the political narratives sometimes, because they win elections, and how can we educate general society? I mean, it would take tens of millions of dollars to do it, but how do you educate the, general society that this is who's in prison and you're paying for this. You're paying to warehouse human beings when they really don't need to be there in many cases. There's a judge out of Ohio that does this reentry court, and she reviews cases and releases people while they're incarcerated. I mean, there are best practices out there that are really awesome that can help with these things. Arizona, my home state, they don't have probation parole. You do 85%. If you behave, you do 80%. There's no other way out. And so, and every state's different. I mean, and they're all similar, but they're all different. And how do we help the decision makers? Because at the end of the day, we have to help governors understand. That's where we need to be. Directors of corrections work for governors. Now they have major influence. Clearly, they're directors of corrections. But for the courts, they go through the governors. Director of corrections don't control courts. And the courts control who's in prison. The prosecutors, the defenders, the whole criminal justice system. How do we educate them on the cause and effect of the current model? And it really doesn't need to be this way. There are ways to do risk assessments for people incarcerated, to identify risk of re-crime, and we're just not very good at doing that because politically being soft or any perception on soft on crime, and it's a perception, whether you're Democrat or Republican or independent, it doesn't matter. If there's a perception of soft on crime, there's a good chance you're not going to get elected, and so, so that narrative drives policy. And that policy drives recidivism, so it's how do we educate folks?
You mentioned at the beginning about the idea of changing staff all the time and not supposed to be having any personal type relationship with anybody that's in there. But by doing that, it makes the people that are housed there lose their contact with, I don't want to say normal people, but people from the outside world that can be a good influence on them. And, I understand the whole thing like, oh, you don't want them to be friends, but if you're going to be working with somebody for 10 years, what could happen if there was that conversation happening back and forth? What would happen if who's ever overseeing the pod had weekly check-ins and they had small groups where they talked with each other rather than that us and them and that division all the time in the power structure to make it more rehabilitative rather than punitive?
I mean, that's dynamic security. I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, there are lines that can't be crossed in U.S. corrections. I will say that. You, as an officer, you need to be, our model is dynamic security. So it's the Norway principles, but we merged it with the coach model, the life coaching skills. And so we don't certify officers to be coaches, but we teach them in coaching skills. So asking open-ended questions, do you have a GED? Do you have an education? Well, what's the response? No. Okay, well, have you thought about getting enrolled or at least on the waiting list for within the facility? No, I don't need that. Okay, well, you do know that no education equals like 100% recidivate? Do you want to live in prison? Well, no. Well, let me help you get on the waiting list. Well, I'm not comfortable with math. We have peer coaches that'll help you with that stuff. You don't have to worry. And, so you're not a friend with the incarcerated. You don't have a personal relationship, but you're using coaching skills in a dynamic security model to encourage people. And that's where you got to be, there has to be a line. If I'm an officer and I'm talking to an incarcerated person, I can ask them about their kids and their family. I can say I'm a parent, but I can't talk about my kids and my family. There are certain lines that you can't cross. And that's where corrections is nervous, because once I cross that line, I am better manipulated. I'll use that word, and to bring in, if I disagree with what the system is doing, I might be encouraged or, through payment to bring in drugs or cell phones or what have you, or even worse, fall in love, which in corrections is love, because somebody who's in love will do anything for the person they're in love with. So there's got to be some boundaries there that you don't cross that line, but we believe there's a way of doing that and trusting the staff to not cross that line. I did this in prisons and I had less staff compromise than the traditional model. So I know this idea works because I've done it. So it's just in many ways, you have to prove that this works because the security people, operational wise, if security says no, the answer is no. And you can all the programs in the world, if security says no, unless the warden pushes back and says, no, you're going to do it anyway. If security says no, it's no, and sometimes no is because it's more work and I don't want to do it. Sometimes no is because I drank the Kool-Aid and I've been told that this will get people compromised, so my past experience says no. Sometimes it's risk. Well, if I do this is risky, and then we can get sued and then we lose millions of dollars if so-and-so gets compromised. I mean, so there's a lot involved there, but there is a way to find that line where staff aren't crossing it to being compromised, but yet it's a human interaction between a resident and an officer, caring interaction. That is possible.
I like hearing that. You did a really good job explaining that. Thank you. That caring, that's, and it doesn't have to be like you said. It's not the sharing of the personal information, but it is sharing of skills and things that are needed and still being kind while doing it. Yeah, I know that I totally understand the whole thing about not getting close to somebody in prison because the work that I did, we knew some of the people before we went into the prison because of the community we worked in.
Right.
And not only that, we worked with them when they came out because I worked for a mental health agency that cycled them through. So I had to be very careful on how I worked in drug and alcohol. So I was in the courts and in the jails. So my roles were all over the place. And it was real hard sometimes to make sure that that understanding was there, that I don't break the rules. And they used to joke with me and say, well, you know what her nickname is? And they say, no, what is it? No. You're going to ask me to do anything. Can you bring this? No. Can you bring this in? No. Can you do? No. It was just.
Which is even with our model, that's the answer.
You have to, because there are reasons those rules and regulations are put in place. Can I talk a little bit about visits? Did you have anything overseeing visits or rules and regulations around visits?
Oh,
I'm
of
curious
course.
how like family visits were done, if there was any special things done for people that had children or if they had to visit right in the visit room.
Well, visitation, again, it's a security issue. So how do you bring compassion to allowing a loved one to come visit their incarcerated without allowing contraband or problems to happen? Visitation was one of the ways contraband entered a prison. It's really hard to stop it from happening because in the beginning of the visits they're allowed for a kiss and a hug. Well, you can pass drugs through a kiss. And if a incarcerated person swallows it, then you're not going to find it. There are ways to, a metal detector isn't going to find drugs. There are ways to hide that stuff on the way in. So there's this constant battle about um, how do you allow compassion and loved ones to visit without allowing the very few who will do it to compromise security and bring in drugs and stuff that's not supposed to be there. So, so you're always fighting that battle. What does that look like? You can't have free, because if you do, you're gonna have all kinds of drugs in your prison. And for your audience that don't know, somebody who is high or on something, whether it's alcohol or drugs, are very prone to violence. I mean, quite prone to violence. And so that's where that security thing comes into play. How do you best prohibit that stuff from getting in without showing some compassion, and some heart for families who are trying to visit? And that's where that challenge comes in. Now, you treat visitors with respect and dignity, and I know in many systems that just doesn't happen. You're a cog in a wheel, and they won't even, some of the staff won't even smile or say good morning to you. And so you can have the security component of it while having some decency about human beings. And we did kids programs too, because sometimes when you have a child area and you have a parent who doesn't manage your child and they're over there being super disruptive while everyone else is trying to visit, you end up closing it because although you want to do something good, you can't allow that area, I mean, a play area, if you want to call it as such, to disrupt the whole visitation room. And correctional officers aren't supervisors of kids, so how do you manage all of that? And I mean, I think the answer is security protocols have to happen, but you just need to make sure that the family members are treated with respect and dignity. I mean, you only have so much time to visit, depending on how big the facility is. You have to divide it by everybody. You only have a budget that'll pay for so much, and then how can you use that budget, by those staff, in order to do that. And then if they're short security staff, which is the national crisis right now, by the way, we won't fix recidivism if we don't fix officer retention. If they're super short of security staff, they're going to pull primary staff back into core posts, and visitation isn't one of them. Programs isn't one of them. Recreation isn't one of them necessarily. That's why you see a lot more lockdowns now, across the United States, because security, if you're 20 staff short on the beginning of shift, you're going to consolidate it back. You even lock down the population if you don't have enough. If you don't have enough staff to manage the population, respond to emergencies, they're going to lock it down because security trumps everything. So, visitation's affected by that. If we don't get past the officer retention challenges, we will never have an effective visitation program. It's all cause and effect.
And also, if we reduce the prison population, we won't need so much staff.
Yeah, that's a bit of a loaded statement because you have to have a significant reduction in order to reduce staff.
Exactly.
You can't reduce 20 people in a 100-person pod. You still got to staff it. Yes, significant reduction does require or enable the facility to reduce the staff, which reduces the work burden. But I'm not sure in many states that's the case right now. I think you'll see populations have leveled off after COVID. There was a significant drop. I think you're seeing some trends going up across the country, even though crime is going down. So that's all cause and effect. But that's a whole podcast in it by itself. Yeah. So, it's if there's not enough security, critical programs will be shut down, and families will get frustrated, residents will get frustrated, the system gets frustrated, officers get frustrated. They're being forced to work overtime constantly. They don't get to go home to their families. Back to what I said earlier, what is the lifespan of a correctional officer? 17 years less than everybody else's because of the stress of the job.
I worked as a volunteer, and for the first 2 years, I was working at a very old facility that had the old metal gate clang.
Wow.
So we would call them the chambers, because what they did is they would allow you into one section and they'd lock you in this cage before they opened up the next one. And for 2 years straight, when I would dream, I would hear that in my dreams. So I can't imagine living in that environment or working in that environment and being there 5 days a week or 3 12-hour shifts, however they're working, and then going home and trying to block that out.
Yeah, well, there's
Brian,
been a
has
little
there been anything that we haven't covered that's just eating at you today that we need to talk about?
our nonprofit is unique. I'd like to talk about that for a second.
Yes, please tell us more about
Yeah,
that.
it's the nonprofit was born basically out of frustrations with the system, not necessarily private prisons by any stretch, but by corrections as a whole and the outcomes. We look at recidivism level, we recycle human beings in this country. And, for your audience, just understand there are many definitions of recidivism. So be careful about trying to do an apples to apples comparison. Well, this state has 20% recidivism. Well, this state has 18% recidivism. Well, this state's doing better. Well, what's the definition? Take a look at plus systems tend to define it the way that best shows the numbers. But the end of the day is the U.S. does, in essence, works as it's designed. It's designed to warehouse, and that's not corrections' fault. Corrections didn't build that system. The courts put the people in there, and corrections just had to respond to the bodies, to the numbers that they put in there. Even though corrections gets blamed for it. But the reality is we have to bring some innovation. Corrections has been the same. The outcomes have really been similar for hundreds of years, in essence. Of course, the 80s have really amplified with the changes in the drug laws. We need to bring innovation to the problem, because more of the same is not going to change anything. And that's who we are as a nonprofit. Corrections is a government responsibility, period. The government leaders are fighting fires every single day. The average tenure of a director of corrections is around 2.5 years. There's no research on that, but just from personal experience and talking to directors of corrections. And then so you have constant churn of leadership, which is not good. They have the bureaucracy of whatever the governor's priorities are going to affect corrections, which isn't always for the good of corrections. But the budgets, the House and the Senate set the budget approved by the governor's office. When you're incarcerating that many people, here's Arizona own example. Corrections is the third largest budget line item. It's like $1.7, $1.8 billion this year. And the population's not going up, but the budget's going up. Our nonprofit has the ability to kind of step back, look at best practices from across the world, from across the United States, build in a culture changing model. And that's really who we are, is we are a resource for the government to change culture. We have 3 tiers to our model. Number 1 is to operate prisons and jails as a nonprofit, outcomes-based. We are not private prisons. We don't have ownership, and we don't have a profit motive, although we're not government, because we're a nonprofit. But our purpose isn't to run all the prisons and jails. Our purpose is to model what it could look like, measure the outcomes, strong research component, and then once we prove it works, help the government implement it. And help them understand there is a different way, a better way moving forward. So number 1. Number 2 is to help with the medical. About half of corrections, jails, and prisons in the country use for-profit medical companies. And I'm not saying they're all bad, they're not, but many are. The profit motive is distracting on providing quality medical care inside of a correctional setting. Our vision is, and we bid on 12 contracts or RFPs now. We haven't won any of them because everyone's like, where you are now? Well, we're new. We got like 300 years of experience in our team, but the idea is new. So we haven't quite crossed that barrier yet. But we want to help on the medical front too, because that's super important to a healthy life, wellness, and success upon release. And the last thing is consulting, specifically correctional officer retention. That's our focus. Because again, root cause, if we don't bring purpose to the job, correctional officers aren't going to stay. And the current Kool-Aid, as I use, is not a purpose-driven Kool-Aid. It's a compliance-driven Kool-Aid. And so we also have a peer coach model that's not research-based, where you take lifers or long-term, hand select them, train them as life coaches, and then let them help within the prison setting. So they're a force multiplier, especially with the younger population that tends to be a bit violent and distracting and young. And how do you help them understand that that's not a healthy way of life? Because that's all they know. So the dynamic security with the officers and a peer coach model inside, where you have peers also helping the officers help the population, that's powerful. So, so our nonprofit model is very innovative. It's the first of its kind. It's never existed in the U.S. There are 3 nonprofit models in the world, but none of them are outcomes based. So we're the first of our kind in the world. But as an operator, as very senior experienced warden, I know it'll work. I have no doubt and no question. It's just finding that governor or that director of corrections or that legislator that says, I really like what you're doing. Let's try that and then measure, because we can save money too, which is corrections is expensive. And if we help people get out and stay out, well, that's less expensive. So not to include, we significantly reduce crime because people getting out are desperate and making desperate choices and causing more victims. But when they're not recidivating, there's less victims. I mean, it's just a cause and effect opportunity here. So that's who we are. If you believe change is possible, if you like innovation and a bit of disruption, look us up. If you have the financial means to support, when I left the warden's chair, I thought this idea was common sense and raising money would be easy. Nope, not easy at all. We do have some foundations that have been really awesome. But at the end of the day, $5, $25 will make a difference. If you have that ability, to help us, please do. Once we get these engagements with the government, it'll be self-funded, which is kind of cool. But until we get there, we are a radical idea, really. And until we're proven, until somebody says, I like that, let's give that a shot, we're not going to have the opportunity to help.
I like that radical idea. That's what I was called in my early years, a radical. Not anymore. Hey, Brian, thank you so much. Before I forget it, though, can you give the name of the company one more time and the website?
You bet. Happy to share. Social Purpose Corrections. So spcor.org. So basically Social Purpose Core. That's the other websites domains were taken, so I had to use that one. But SPCOR.
Okay, great. So now people know where to find you. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today, because it's conversations like this that open our minds and open our hearts. So gives us better understanding of each other, and the work that we're all trying to do is really all the same, even though we're coming from different directions.
Thank you, Valerie. And thank you to the audience for listening.
Thank you so much. Well, we're wrapping up another edition of the Prison Pod. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back again next week.
You have been listening to the Prison Pod, a podcast not just for those in prison but for anyone who has been affected by incarceration. Ms. Valerie would love for you to write to her with your questions, comments, and show ideas. The address is Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine. 04473.